They don't set leave all at once, do they? No. Avoidants don't vanish in a clean break. They disappear by degrees. A little less presence. A little more silence. A slower response here. A strange coldness there. And you feel it, that ache of disconnection, but you don't want to name it, because naming it would make it real. And if it's real, it means it's already happening. So you overfunction. You soften your tone. You shrink your needs. You try to become easier to love, because deep down, you've been trained to believe that love is earned in the moments you're being abandoned. And that sets the hook. The part no one talks about. Avoidants don't just leave. They activate your deepest programming, the one that whispers, if I can just be good enough, calm enough, patient enough, maybe he'll come back. But what if the very thing you're doing to hold him close is what's pushing him further away? What if the chase isn't noble but a trauma reenactment? I want you to feel something right now. Not guilt, not shame, just clarity. That twinge of recognition when someone finally names the game you've been trapped in. Because this isn't just about a person. It's about a pattern. One that shows up in different faces but plays the same script. Intensity, connection, withdrawal, confusion, over and over. And you tell yourself it was real. You felt something, and I believe you did. I know he did too. But here's the truth. Most never say aloud. Avoidants do fall in love, but they fear what love reveals. Love exposes them. It makes them feel seen, too seen. And for someone who's built safety in distance, that kind of exposure feels like danger. So they leave, not always physically, but emotionally, they evacuate. Slowly, strategically, sometimes even kindly. And it leaves you spinning because there's no clear ending, no explanation, just absence. And here's where most get stuck. In the silence. Interpreting it. Justifying it. Blaming themselves for it. But what if that silence wasn't mystery, but a weapon? What if his disappearance isn't about your worth, but about his wiring? Because the second you start seeing his retreat, not as rejection, but as avoidance, you shift out of desperation and into understanding. And that's where the power begins. Let's start with the truth that hurts the most. Avoidants don't leave because of you. They leave because closeness feels like a threat to them. That's the hardest pill to swallow, especially when you've spent days, months, maybe even years analyzing every word you said, every mistake you might have made. You scroll through messages, replay conversations, obsess over the moment the shift began, thinking, what did I do? But you didn't trigger abandonment, you triggered intimacy. And for an avoidant, that's the real danger. See, when someone grows up in an environment where closeness was inconsistent, unsafe, or overwhelming, they learn to equate love with suffocation. They adapt by armoring themselves with independence, control, and emotional distance. And that armor becomes their identity. So when someone like you enters, someone open, warm, curious, and emotionally present, they feel the pull and panic. You weren't too much. You were too real. You cracked the mask. You offered intimacy without chaos, love without performance, and that's foreign to them, almost unbearable. Have you ever noticed how they light up when you lean back, when you seem unavailable, when you're not on them? That's not love growing. That's their nervous system relaxing, because to them, emotional space equals safety, not because they're heartless, but because their wiring tells them love equals danger. And the cruel irony, the moment they start to feel truly connected is the moment their defenses rise up. Walls reappear, distance returns, and you, unaware of the internal war they're fighting, interpret the retreat as disinterest. You try harder, reach more, offer softness. But it doesn't soothe them, it suffocates them. Not because you're wrong, but because you're available. And to someone avoidant, availability feels like entrapment. This is where the cycle cements itself. The more you move toward them, the more they move away, and both of you are trying to survive. But here's where something powerful happens. When you stop chasing and start observing, the entire dynamic flips. You begin to see his distance not as a reflection of your value, but a mirror of his fear. His silence stops being a punishment and becomes data. You don't internalize it. You witness it. And in that witnessing, you reclaim your energy, your self-respect, your emotional sovereignty. Because when you stop trying to convince someone to stay, you give yourself the space to see who's really capable of showing up. But let's go even deeper, because the next truth cuts both ways. The reason you keep attracting avoidance is because something in you recognizes the pattern. Now that's not blame, that's awareness. A quiet, soul-level recognition that your nervous system is familiar with the push-pull, the hot and cold, the emotional ambiguity. That kind of dynamic isn't just triggering, it's oddly safe, because it mimics something old. Maybe it was the parent who loved you but couldn't fully attune. The caregiver who provided for you but couldn't see you. Or maybe it was a first love that taught you attention is always temporary. So when an avoidant shows up, mysterious, magnetic, slightly out of reach, your system lights up not in fear, but in recognition. Ah, this. I know this. I can do this. And you can. You know how to wait, how to perform patience, how to decode silence like a second language. You know how to live on emotional crumbs and call it connection. That's the haunting skill set many of us develop, the ability to endure absence while longing for presence. But endurance isn't set intimacy, and longing isn't set love. You weren't meant to be an emotional contortionist, bending yourself around someone else's avoidance just to feel halfway held. You weren't built to walk on eggshells, calculating your every word so he won't disappear again. That's not love. That's survival. So here's the shift. The moment you stop interpreting his distance as mystery and start seeing it as avoidance, your nervous system can finally breathe. The spell breaks. You stop calling emotional unavailability depth. You stop confusing chemistry with chaos. And you begin to rewrite the definition of connection. It's not adrenaline. It's not longing. It's not waiting for him to finally become consistent. It accepts safety, simplicity, reciprocity. And yes, that might feel boring at first, because real intimacy isn't a dopamine spike. It's not the roller coaster you've been conditioned to crave. It's a steady, open hand, not a closed fist you keep trying to pry open. That shift from chasing intensity to choosing stability is the quiet revolution that sets you free. And here sits the kicker. When you stop needing him to come back, that steps when the avoidant often does. Because now you're no longer chasing. You're no longer leaking energy. You've stopped trying to be chosen and started choosing yourself. And that energy, that sits what disrupts the cycle. If this is landing for you, subscribe. We're just getting started. Now let's talk about the comeback, the part that keeps so many people on the hook. Because avoidants almost always circle back. They return not because they've transformed, but because your absence feels more manageable than your presence ever did. Let that sink in. Your availability triggered their fear. Your absence soothes it. So when you finally stop reaching out, when you pull your energy back, not as a strategy, but from genuine exhaustion or growth, they feel the shift. Not in their heart necessarily, but in their control. You're no longer orbiting them. You're no longer feeding their sense of importance. And now they're curious again. So they reappear, sometimes gently, sometimes boldly. A hey, just thinking of you, a like on your story, a random meme. They test the waters. They sniff for availability, not necessarily because they're ready for intimacy, but because they're drawn to the safety of your longing. Because here sits the brutal truth. They know what it feels like to be chased, but they've never learned how to stay. They don't come back because they've suddenly become secure. They come back because you made them feel desired without demanding depth. And now that the supply is gone, they want to taste again, not necessarily of you, but of what you gave them access to, emotional warmth, without responsibility. And here's where most people fall back in. Because it feels like love, the return feels like proof. He missed me. He realized he's coming back because he cares. And maybe part of him does, but caring isn't the same as capacity. So when he returns, you have to ask, is he here for connection or for comfort? Is he showing up with openness, accountability, and a willingness to sit in discomfort? Or is he slipping back in just enough to avoid his own loneliness? Because if you accept breadcrumbs again, if you resume the old role without new requirements, the cycle resets. Temporary closeness, subtle withdrawal, emotional confusion. Again. This is where your clarity becomes your shield. You don't need to slam doors. You don't need to yell, but you do need to see clearly. Is his return a reckoning or a reflex? Is he showing up to rebuild something sacred or to refill the ego he empties every time he ghosts? You get to choose this time, and that's the power most never realize they have. Because the moment you stop hoping he'll change and start embodying the change yourself, you no longer need his return to mean anything. You are no longer waiting to be chosen. You are standing in the truth of your own emotional worth. But let's really ask the question that hides underneath it all. Why do you still want him to come back? It starts not a judgment. It starts an invitation. Because most of the time, we don't want the actual person. We want the closure they stole. We want the fantasy they sold. We want to be proven right about our own worth. If he comes back, then it means I mattered. But what if you mattered even if he never does? What if the proof of your value was never in his return, but in your release? See, avoidants don't just ghost your phone. They haunt your self-concept. They leave behind a residue of confusion, self-doubt, and unfinished narratives. And when they resurface, even briefly, the hope returns like a tidal wave. Hope that this time will be different. Hope that he finally gets it. Hope that your waiting will be rewarded. But hope, untethered from reality, becomes self-abandonment. You give him back the power to define your worth. You hand him the pen and beg him to write the ending. And every time you do, you shrink. Not because you're weak, but because you were never meant to beg for resolution from someone who runs from responsibility. He can give you the closure you crave because his entire identity is built on avoiding that level of truth. So here steps the radical shift. You stop waiting for the apology. You stop rehearsing what you still say when he finally comes back ready. You stop fantasizing about the version of him that doesn't exist. And you face what's real. Not the fantasy, not the projection, not the illusion. The real is this: he left. Not because you were too much, but because he couldn't hold what you offered. And the moment you stop taking that personally is the moment you become emotionally untouchable. Because your value doesn't shrink in the presence of someone who can't receive it. It shines. It confronts them. It unsettles them. And if they're not ready, they will leave. Not because you're unworthy, but because your presence demands a level of intimacy they haven't earned the right to hold. And you no longer fight to be understood. You speak with truth and let people disqualify themselves. Because the healed version of you doesn't need him to come back. She sees his return not as a romance, but as a test. Send this to someone who's been stuck in this dynamic for far too long. There's something else we need to name. The addiction to the potential version of him. You didn't fall in love with who he is. You fell for who he could be if only he weren't so afraid. If only he were ready. If only he would open. And that if only becomes your prison. You wait for the version of him that shows up in rare, fleeting moments. The one who laughed with you late at night. The one who opened up just enough to keep you hoping. The one who seemed to see you before he vanished again into that familiar fog. But here's the thing about avoidance. They're masters of glimpses. They'll give you just enough light to stay hopeful, but never enough heat to feel held. And that's what keeps you hooked. Not the reality, but the fantasy. So you stay. You hold on. You try to earn the version of him you saw in flashes. Because if you could just be more understanding, more patient, more accommodating, maybe that version would become permanent. But people aren't projects. Love isn't rehab. And you're not here to mother a man out of his avoidance. Because when you love someone's potential, you're not in relationship with them. You're in relationship with a story, one you wrote, one you carry, one you protect every time reality threatens to rewrite it. And that story is exhausting you. So here sits the shift. You start telling the truth, not just to others, to yourself. The truth that his inconsistency is not a mystery. It's a message. The truth that your anxiety is not proof of love. It's evidence of emotional deprivation. The truth that staying hopeful for someone who keeps wounding you, no matter how softly, is not romantic. It's self-abandonment dressed up as devotion. And I get it. Letting go of the potential version of someone feels like a death because you weren't just attached to him, you were attached to the future you imagined with him, the one where he finally shows up, where you're finally chosen, where it all makes sense. But what if that future is costing you your present? What if every moment you wait for him to become who he never promised to be is a moment you're stealing from yourself? You don't need to hate him. You don't need to rage, but you do need to grieve the story. Because only then can you return to yourself. The real you, the one who doesn't need to chase breadcrumbs, the one who doesn't wait to be loved in halves, the one who realizes that the love you're craving already exists within you. Let's talk about the final illusion, the idea that if you could just understand him enough, you could finally be safe. You've studied his trauma, you've read about attachment theory, you've analyzed his every move like a code to be cracked. Because if you could just understand, maybe it wouldn't hurt so much. Maybe the distance would feel less personal. Maybe the leaving wouldn't feel like rejection. And knowledge does bring clarity. It helps. But here's what it doesn't do. It doesn't change the fact that you're still doing all the emotional labor. Understanding someone's fear doesn't mean you have to sit inside it. Empathy doesn't mean endurance. Compassion doesn't mean compliance. Because there's a line, a quiet, sacred line, where self-awareness turns into self-sacrifice. Where your wisdom becomes a weapon you turn inward, blaming yourself for staying too long, or worse, believing that your insight is enough to save the relationship. But love doesn't work like that. It's not a rescue mission. It's not a reward for your emotional intelligence. You can know everything about why he runs and still not be the person he chooses to stay for. And that has to be okay. Because when you finally release the need to decode someone else's behavior, you reclaim the right to feel your own. You're allowed to feel hurt, to feel angry, to feel disappointed. You're allowed to miss him and still block him, to love him and still choose yourself. You're allowed to say, I see your pain, but I will not make it my home. That boundary, the one that says, I understand you, but I won't lose myself for you, is the birthplace of true power. Because when you stop trying to fix him, You begin healing you. You begin remembering what it feels like to be safe in your own skin, to trust your intuition, to feel peace instead of walking on glass. And in that peace, something wild happens. Your standards rise, your clarity sharpens, and your energy starts repelling anything that cannot meet you fully. That is when you stop attracting avoidance. Not because you start doing more, but because you finally believe that love should feel like freedom, not confusion. That affection should be consistent, not earned. That presence should be offered, not extracted. And when you carry that knowing into every room you enter, every connection, every conversation, you become untouchable to anyone who cannot meet you there. You don't need to scream it. You don't need to prove it. Your energy says, I have been through fire. I have seen what seems false. And I choose real now. So maybe he left. Maybe he ghosted, faded, made excuses, or disappeared into a silence you were forced to fill with your own meaning. And maybe you're still standing in the aftershock, trying to understand, trying to fix, trying to prove that what you shared was real. Let me tell you something that no one told me when I was in that place. You don't need closure from someone who never gave you clarity. You don't need answers from someone who ran from the question. You don't need him to come back to validate what you already felt. You knew it was real. You knew there was connection. You knew he saw you, even if just for a moment. But real love is instead measured by glimpses. It's best measured by consistency, safety, presence. And if he couldn't offer that, if he left when it got too real, that is your answer. You are not hard to love. You are hard to manipulate. You are hard to contain. You are hard to fool once you start trusting your own nervous system again. And maybe that's what this was all for, not to teach you how to hold on tighter, but how to let go sooner. Not to make you better for him, but to make you visible to yourself again. Because what you want, the deep, steady, soul-safe connection, doesn't live in the shadowy corners of emotional avoidance. It lives in the open, in the warm light of mutuality, vulnerability, and reciprocal care. And yes, you will grieve him. Not just the person, but the future, the fantasy, the identity you formed around trying to be enough. But in that grief, something new is born, your standard. The quiet, powerful boundary that whispers, I don't set chase what walks away from intimacy. And if he ever comes back, if the avoidant reappears at your door, as they so often do, you'll meet him not with rage, not with desperation, but with clarity. You still ask, are you here to build something real or just to soothe your guilt? And depending on the answer, you'll know exactly what to do. Because now, you start no longer waiting. You start leading, living, loving yourself better than he ever could. If you felt yourself in this, if something in your body is finally exhaling, subscribe. Not because you have to, but because you're ready to walk with people who see what you see now. You stir not alone anymore. We soar here, and we soar just getting started.